We continue now at the top of Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph and Meseches Yevamos. This is Yevamos Daf 33a. On the previous Amud, the Gemara brought a number of cases where Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapara argue whether the person is Chayiv 2 or whether the person is Chayiv 1, and it's going to be related to this issue of whether Isser is Chal al Isser. And so the Gemara now explains, B'mai kol miflagi. So what are they arguing about? Be'isser kolal, they're arguing about Isser kolal. Now Rashi over here says, Be'isser kolal l'kamei meforish. This will be explained later on. My Isser kolal iko. Why all these cases, or why these cases involve Isser kolal. V'aliba de Rabbi Yossi. And they're arguing, meaning Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapara are arguing within the sheet of Rabbi Yossi. And Rashi says, V'aliba de Rabbi Yossi, Domer b'shari surei, Isser chal al Isser al yedei migo. By other cases, so Rabbi Yossi had said that we do say that Isser is chal al Isser as long as you have some kind of migo, since it's being chal somewhere else, so therefore it's going to be chal al ha-isser. So that's exactly what they're arguing about in a situation of Isser kolal. What would Rabbi Yossi hold? Rabbi Chia savar Rabbi Yossi be'isser kolal mechayev tarti. Rabbi Chia holds that according to Rabbi Yossi by Isser kolal yechayev 2. And Bar Kapara savar, Bar Kapara holds lo mechayev el echad, you only chayev 1. As Rashi over here says, be'isser kolal mechayev tarti dekotani chayev mishum eshasach umishum achos isha. So he says that you're chayiv, it says you're chayiv because of Eshasach, and you're chayiv because of Achos Isha. Again, that was Rabbi Yossi's opinion. And Rashi over here explains, Be'isr kol al mechayiv tarti, again, according to Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Yossi would say, by Isr kol you're chayiv twice. Dekatani chayiv misham Eshasach misham Achos Isha, because again, Rabbi Yossi's shita was that if you have a situation where the brother marries the woman and it's a situation of Eshasach and Achos Isha, you're chayiv for both. Afilu nasa meis v'achar kach nasa chay. And Rabbi Yossi would say that even in a situation where the brother who died, he actually got married first, and then the brother who was alive got married. In other words, it was a situation where the Isser of Eshes, where the Isser of Achos Isha came second. The Leka Isser Mosef B'hai Basra, because here you don't have a situation of anything being added on. Ela Isser Kolal. It's like we said on the previous Amud, that's actually a case of an Isser Kolal. In other words, when you have a situation where it's Eshesach, where the brother who died gets married first, so at that point in time, that woman is Usser to all of the brothers because of a situation of Eshesach. Then you're going to add on the Achos Isha for this other particular brother. That's not mosif anything to the woman who's married to the brother who dies. It doesn't add anything on. The only thing that it really does is now this particular brother can't marry all of her sisters. That's considered Isser Kolal. So Migo de Mitzar Bekulu Achvasa Kolal Gamezuimon. Maybe you'll say that since we have this Isser Kolal, you're adding in, you're including all of the sisters, so therefore we'll also add on, and besides for Eshasach, there'll also be the prohibition of Achos Isha on the widow of the brother that died. And Rashi continues that Bar Kapara holds lo mechayev el echad, that you're only going to be chayev 1. V'chi chayev Rabbi Yossi tarti. So according to that understanding, when did Rabbi Yossi say you're chayev 2 by the situation of Eshasach and Achos Isha? That's only b'nasa chayev yachar kach nasa meis. That's only if the living brother, he got married first, and then the brother who died got married. In other words, if the living brother got married first, so then at that point in time there's a situation of Achos Isha on the woman, and now if the brother who died gets married, now you have an additional prohibition on the same woman. That's Isser Mosif to all of the other brothers. The Isser Mosif, that's the case of Isser Mosif. And in other words, according to the opinion of Bar Kapar, that's the only case Rabbi Yossi would say that you're chayiv twice. And Rashi continues and points out, in that which we learned earlier, Rabbi Shimon Omer Eino Chayiv Ela Misham Eishas Ach. There was a brisa earlier that said that Rabbi Shimon holds you only chayiv 1, and which one are you chayiv? Only because of Eishas Ach. Do Kimna B'Nasa Meis V'Achar Kach Nasachai. Now the Gemara said that statement of Rabbi Shimon was talking specifically where the brother who died, he got married first, meaning Eishas Ach came first, and then came Nasachai, and so therefore the Achos Isha Isser is not Chal on the Isser of Eishas Ach. So you see from that Gemara, clearly we are understanding that the Brisa is talking about a situation of Nasa Meis V'Achar Kach Nasachai, but we're saying according to Bar Kapara, like we just said earlier in Rashi, that Rabbi Yossi is only Mechayev Tarti by Nasachai V'Achar Kach Nasa Meis. The Brisa is not talking about Nasa Meis V'Achar Kach Nasachai, and so Rashi says to that, you'll have to say Rabbi Chia Tani La, Bar Kapara Lo Tani La. That earlier Gemara, that was according to the opinion of Rabbi Chia, again, that the Brisa was discussing a situation of Nasa Meis V'Achar Kach Nasachai, or even discussing a situation of Nasa Meis V'Achar Kach Nasachai. It's not going to work according to Bar Kapara, because he says that we're only talking about Nasachai V'Achar Kach Nasa Meis. And so the Gemara continues, Umay Yisr Kolal Ika Hacha. But what is the Yisr Kolal over here on the cases that were listed in the previous Amud? Why are these cases of Yisr Kolal? And the Gemara explains, Bishlam Zar Meikara Shari B'Malacha V'Yasar Ba'avoda. So we can understand by the situation of a Zor doing the avoda on Shabbos. So originally he's allowed to do malacha, meaning before Shabbos he can do malacha. Of course he's not allowed to do avoda in the Beis HaMikdash. As Yola Shabbos, now Shabbos comes along, and we can say the following type of kolel migo. Migo dukam mitzvah b'malacha. Since Shabbos comes along and says that he's also to do malacha, so that's an isser of Shabbos, so mitzvah nami ba'avoda. So that's also going to come and say that he's also to do avoda. In other words, it's like an additional isser that goes on top of the isser of asr ba'avoda. A zor in general is asr ba'avoda. Shabbos comes along and asers him in malacha in general, and therefore that isser of malacha in general can go on top of the isser of avoda. And the Gemara says we can also understand by balmum, a situation of, let's say, a Kohen who's a balmum. Meikara shari bachila. Originally he's allowed to eat the asr ba'avoda, but he's not allowed to do the avoda. Itmile, now this balmum becomes tameh. So migo dekam mitzvah ba'achila, since he now is asr and achila, so mitzvah nami ba'avoda. So we can say that it goes on to the avoda as well. And again, there's going to be two isurim over here involved in doing the avoda in the Beis HaMikdash. Ela Malika, but when it comes to the case of Malika, that was a case of Malika for a Zor. So bevasachas hi demashkachas law. That all happens at one time. In order for it to be Nisr Kolel, you have to have something not exist, and then you add on an Isser, and we say, well, Migo that you added on, so we'll add it on to the original Isser as well. But by Malika, it all happens at the same time. So be Isser Kolel lo mashkachas law. That was one of the cases before, and yet we cannot figure out how that's a case of Isser Kolel. And we'll take a look at Rashi over here. Meikara kodem Shabbazu. Again, this is the situation of the Zor who's doing the Avod in the Beis HaMikdash on Shabbos. So Meikara, meaning before the Shabbos. So Migo de Mitzvah b'Malacha mishum Shabbos. Since he was Asr in Malacha because of Shabbos, Kolel es ha'avoda bechlal ha'isr mishum Shabbos. So therefore, the Avoda also gets included because of Shabbos. In other words, Shabbos comes along and Asr's in Malacha, so we can also include Avoda in that. V'hachalo shayach Mosif. Now Rashi over here explains this is not the same as Isser Mosif. There's a difference between when something comes along and adds an Isser, or something comes along and it has an Isser attached to it, and so then we include the other Isser. So Rashi says this would not be an example of Mosif. Shaloni Tosef Isser al hachaticha, because on the issue or on the item that we're discussing, there's not another Isser being added onto that item. Dahainu Avoda, that would be the Avoda. In other words, we're talking over here about the Isser of Avoda. Are we adding on another Isser to the Avoda? Rashi gives a theoretical example where we would have Mosif by Avoda. Dami Mosif. What would be an example of Mosif by Avoda? Could go on, for example, if we could say as follows: Avoda meikara asura lezarim umuteres lekohanim. Let's say we could say that Avoda from originally it's asur to zarim and it's mutter to kohanim. Havale Shabbos migo di tosef alo isur legabe kohanim mishum Shabbos. Now, if Shabbos again in theory came along and added on an isur and said, oh, now Avoda's asur to kohanim also, so he tosef nami legabe didei mishum Shabbos. So therefore, since Shabbos adds that to the adds that Kohanim are now Usr as well, so then we'll add on the Isser of Shabbos. That would be a situation of Mosif. You're taking Avoda and Shabbos comes along and adds something to the Isser of Avoda. Again, in theory, let's say Shabbos came along and added on an Isser of Avoda legabe Kohanim, that would be something called Mosif. Now, of course, that doesn't make any sense here because it's not true. When Shabbos comes along, it doesn't create an Isser for the Kohanim. That's why you don't have an Isser Mosif. That would be a theoretical Isser Mosif, but it does not exist in this case. And Rashi continues, Shari Ba'achila, that was talking about the Baal Mum. Originally, he's allowed to eat from Karbanos. That's from a pasuk. It says they can eat from the Kodshim. But Migo de Mitzvah Ba'achila Misham Tuma. Now, since he's Asr in eating because he became Tameh, Chayel Nami Shem Tuma al Avoda. So that same shame of Tuma can be Chal on the Avoda. That's why we say there are two prohibitions regarding the Baal Mum who's Tameh in terms of doing the Avoda. Ela Malika, but when it comes to Malika, Kola lo mashkachas lo. We don't have Isser Kolel over here. Da b'shas Malika chayli tarvayu, because when we're talking about here a Zor with Malika, it's at the moment of Malika that everything is Chal. The Cholzman shalo nimlaka, because before you do the Malika on the bird, so hayala Isser Me'ila. The only Isser that exists, that's an Isser of Me'ila. You're not allowed to get personal benefit from Kodship. V'lo zeu Isser Zora sa'amur b'karbon sheniter la'achilas kohanim. That is not related to the Isser of a Zor, because a Zor is not allowed to take from a carbon that was mutter to Kohanim. At this point, it's not mutter to Kohanim either. You haven't done Malika yet. Now, at the moment that the Malika is done and now it's fit for the Kohanim, so Paka Mina Isra Azaras Me'ila, the Isra of Me'ila, that's gone. The Chayil Ala Isra Zaras, and now the Isra of Zaras comes at that time, at that exact same time. The Zar Lo Yochal the Isra Malika Bevasachas. So therefore, you have the Isra of Zaras and the Isra of eating from this bird, which you didn't shecht, but instead you did Malika. That all comes at the exact same moment. That's not called Kolal. In all the other cases of Isra Kolal, you had an Isra that was already really there chronologically earlier, and then you're adding on something else. And so the Gemara continues and gives another answer. Rather, what they're actually arguing about, this is talking again about Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapara, they're arguing about this concept of Isser B'vas Achas, V'aliba de Rabbi Yossi, and again they're arguing within the sheet of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Chia Sava, Rabbi Yossi, B'Isser B'vas Achas, Mechayev Tarti. Rabbi Chia holds that Rabbi Yossi says, by Isser B'vas Achas, you're Chayev too. Bar Kapara Sava, Lo Mechayev Elachada. But Bar Kapara says, no, in a situation of Bas Achas, you're only going to be Chayev one. And Rashi over here explains, and again, this is within the sheet of Rabbi Yossi by the situation of Eishes Ach and Achos Isha, Mechayev Tarti, you're Chayev twice. The Hodika Amar Le'el Chayev Shtaim, that which we said earlier, that you're Chayev too, Kegon Sheba Olav Isser de Eishes Ach v'Achos Isha Ke'echad. The case is where you have a situation of both Isurim actually happening at the same time. The Isser of Eishes Ach and the Isser of Achos Isha happen at an identical time. Now, how can that be? Umashkachas la Kegon de Shavinu Shliach Shnei Achin Lekadesh Shtei Achoyos. Let's say they appoint a Shliach, the two brothers appoint a Shliach to be Mekadesh for them, the two sisters. V'hein asu Shliach Lekabel Kiddushin, and they made a Shliach to accept. So you have one person giving to one person, and it's happening at the same time. Upaga Shliach b'Shliach, one Shliach meets the other, both Isurim are Chal at the same time, and so that's actually what they're arguing within Rabbi Yossi. Again, according to Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Yossi will be Mechayev Tarti, but then according to Bar Kapara, Lo Mechayev Elachada, no, it's only going to be one. And when did Rabbi Yossi say two? V'chi Chayev b'Isser Mosef. The only time again where Rabbi Yossi, according to Bar Kapara, where Rabbi Yossi says you're Chayev two, is by Isser Mosef, b'Nosa Chayev Yachar Kach Nosa Meis Kidem Efarish Leil. It's going on that case again where he marries while he's alive, and then he marries where the living brother gets married first. So you have a situation of Achos Isha first, and then the brother who's eventually going to die, he's the one that gets married second. So that's Mosef. Now you're adding on because you have a situation now of Eshesach that now applies to all of the brothers. It doesn't only apply to this brother who married her sister, it now applies to all of the brothers. That's according to Bar Kapara. That's the only case that Rabbi Yossi will say you're Chayev too. And so the Gemara continues. So how are we going to find again in these cases that we discussed on the previous Amud? How are we going to find that the Isurim are Chal at the same time? And so the Gemara explains, Zor shashimish b'Shabbos. Let's say you have the case of the Zor who does the Avod in the Beis HaMikdash on Shabbos. Kegon da'aisi shtei saros b'Shabbos. He grows two hairs on Shabbos, meaning he becomes mature, becomes chayev in mitzvos on Shabbos itself. So therefore both Isurim are going to be chal on Shabbos at the same time. Da'avalu Zoros v'Shabbos b'hadei adadi. Now the Isur in terms of Zoros and the Isur in terms of Shabbos are going to happen at the same time. Baal Mum Nami, when it comes to a Baal Mum, also a similar kind of case. Kegon da'aisi shtei saros v'itmile. You have a situation where he brings forth two saros, two hairs, and becomes tamei. Da'avelei Baal Mum v'tumah b'hadei adadi. There's a situation where he's a Baal Mum and the tumah that happens at the exact same time, because again, until he reaches the age of maturity, that prohibition did not apply, meaning the prohibition of Baal Mum. Inami or shechotach etzbo b'sakin tamei. Let's say you have a following case. He becomes a Baal Mum at the exact same time he becomes tamei. Let's say he cuts off his finger with a knife that was tamei. So again, at the exact same time, you have the prohibitions involving Baal Mum and the prohibitions involving tumah. They're being chal at identical points in time. And the Gemara now continues, and this Gemara relates to the Gemara in the previous Summit. Again, on the previous Summit, there was a machlokis, Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapara, in all these cases, whether you're Chayev 2 or Chayev 1. Rabbi Chia said you're Chayev 2, and Bar Kapara said you're Chayev 1. And so now the Gemara just finished saying that really they're arguing within the sheet of Rabbi Yossi. Now, on the Gemara in the previous Summit, Rabbi Chia got up and he took an oath that he heard from Rebbe you're Chayev 2. And the same thing with Bar Kapara. He gets up and he takes an oath that he heard from Rebbe that you're Chayev 1. And so the Gemara wants to understand how is it that one of these Amorai made a mistake, would take an oath, but was somehow misunderstanding what Rebbe said. And so the Gemara explains, B'shalom al Rebbe Chia. It's good according to Rebbe Chia. Ki asni al Yaliva de Rebbe Yossi. He was taught from Rebbe that you're Chayev 2, and that was following the sheet of Rebbe Yossi. Ki asni al Bar Kapara al Yaliva de Rebbe Shimon. And when it was taught to Bar Kapara, really, Rebbe was telling Bar Kapara what Rebbe Shimon holds, that you're only Chayev 1, and that's the source of the confusion. Bar Kapara got confused and thought that was Lefi, the sheet of Rebbe Yossi. Ela levar Kapara, but according to Bar Kapara, if Bar Kapara over here is saying within Rebbe Yossi that you're Chayev 1, so what exactly does Bar Kapara think that Rebbe Chia is taking an oath about? Rebbe Chia, as the Gemara says, Rebbe Chia shekure kameshaker. Does Bar Kapara think Rebbe Chia is just lying over here? Rebbe Chia gets up and takes an oath that you're Chayev 2. There's no way to explain how Rebbe Chia could have gotten that confused from Rebbe. He wouldn't take an oath that Rebbe said you're Chayev 2 unless you really were Chayev 2. And if Rebbe said you're Chayev 2, it's got to be within the sheet of Rebbe Yossi. There's no other explanation. So how does Bar Kapara even explain what Rebbe Chia understands? And so the Gemara therefore answers, Elo kamiflgi be'isr basachas. Rather, they're arguing in the isr basachas, ve'alibad Rabbi Shimon, just do it the other way around. They're arguing within the shita of Rabbi Shimon. And Rashi over here explains, ve'alibad Rabbi Shimon, that they're arguing within the shita of Rabbi Shimon. And now if that's the case, Rabbi Shimon generally says you're chayev 1. So what does Rabbi Chia mean you're chayev 2? V'hachi kam Rabbi Chia. Here's what Rabbi Chia was saying. Avagav de polig Rabbi Shimon u pater, even though Rabbi Shimon argues and says pater meaning you only chayev 1, hani mili bekolol, that's true only by Yisr kolol. But if both Isurim are chal at the same time, Moda, then he would admit your chayev 2. He would admit, hoel v'lo kadim chad l'chavri, since one didn't come before the other. Ubar kapor amar bebasachas nami polig Rabbi Shimon. And of course, Bar Kapor will say no, even in a situation of basachas, Rabbi Shimon also will argue in that case that you're only chayev 1. But the Gemara continues, even according to this explanation, it's difficult to understand. B'shalom l'Rabbi Chia, I understand according to Rabbi Chia, kamishtab la'afuke l'Rabbi Shimon mechazake. Rabbi Chia is taking an oath that you're chayev 2 because it's to take Rabbi Shimon out of a simple explanation. Meaning the presumption is that Rabbi Shimon says you're always chayev 1, and now Rabbi Chia is getting up and taking an oath and saying he heard from Rabbi that there's an exception, that in a situation of basachas, Rabbi Shimon would actually say you're chayev 2. Elul Bar Kapor, but according to Bar Kapor, lama le'lishtabue. Why is Bar Kapor, if this is the explanation, why is he getting up and taking an oath that he heard from Rabbi that Rabbi Shimon says you're chayev only 1? That's the general sheet of Rabbi Shimon. That's what everyone would assume anyway. And the Gemara says to that kasha, that's indeed difficult. The Gemara continues along the same lines as the argument before, just the other way around. B'shlam Bar Kapor, I understand according to Bar Kapor, meaning from Bar Kapor's perspective, ki asni Rabbi lididei alibad Rabbi Shimon, when Rabbi taught him this halacha that you're chayev 1, that was according to Rabbi Shimon, and ki asni Rabbi Chia alibad Rabbi Yossi, and when Rabbi taught Rabbi Chia you're chayev 2, that was really according to Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Chia just didn't realize that it was according to Rabbi Yossi, thought it was according to Rabbi Shimon. Elul Rabbi Chia, but according to Rabbi Chia from his perspective, so Bar Kapor shkure kamashak, and now Bar Kapor is lying because again, according to Rabbi Chia from his perspective, Rabbi taught him that you're chayev 2 within Rabbi Shimon. So what exactly was taught to Bar Kapor? Bar Kapor is taking an oath that you're chayev only 1. There's no other Tana to attribute that to, so there's no way for Rabbi Chia to explain it. And so the Gemara answers, Amar loch Rabbi Chia can respond to you, Ki asni Rabbi lididei tarti liftor asni. When Rabbi originally taught Bar Kapor the halacha, he taught him 2 of the cases. There were 3 cases on the previous Amud. He taught him 2 of those cases where you're pater, meaning where you're only chayev 1, and they're going to be cases that involved Isser Kolel, and we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Beis.